Lena Hartwell only wanted to help her elderly neighbor keep his home. She took the witness stand with quiet confidence, backed by years of legal knowledge. But within moments, Judge Mallory, a proud, dismissive white man, cut her off and threw out her testimony, scoffing that she sounded too much like a lawyer. What he didn't know, Lena, is the woman who trains federal judges across the country. So what happens when a judge realizes he just silenced the one person who could have taught him everything? If this story sparks something in you, hit like and share it. Now, let's go back to the courtroom that started it all. It was a Thursday morning in Wilkins County, Georgia. The air in the courthouse was still almost bored. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly above rows of aging wooden pews. Most days, no one paid much attention to what went on in courtroom B until Lena Hartwell stepped up to testify. She looked ordinary to the room. Just another middle-aged black woman in a plain beige blouse and a navy skirt that reached just above her ankles. No makeup, no folder of legal documents, no sign of someone important. But when she began to speak, it was clear something about her wasn't so ordinary. She stood for Mr. Reuben Collins, a retired neighborhood watchman, quiet and well-loved by the block. His house, the one he'd lived in for nearly 40 years, was under threat. A shady eviction order, claimed non-compliance, a procedural mess wrapped in a developer's push for new land. Lena had watched this kind of thing happen before, and this time she wasn't going to let them take him down without someone speaking up. Her voice was calm, measured, but not apologetic. Your Honor, per the revised Housing Code, 8-24B subsection 3, a lawful eviction requires a minimum of 60 days' notice issued through certified mail. Mr. Collins received no such notice. Additionally, Judge Mallory Brent didn't lift his head. He twirled his pen slowly between his fingers, pretending to look through a folder. It was only when she paused for breath that he interrupted. "This isn't a law lecture, ma'am," he said, not even looking at her. The room tensed. Lena blinked once, just once. Then she resumed, her voice unchanged. "I'm simply explaining how the law applies to Mr. Collins's case. Section 8-24B is directly relevant to..." The judge looked up now. His expression was flat, almost amused. "Are you a lawyer, Miss Hartwell?" Lena took a breath. "No, Your Honor." "Then don't pretend to be one," he said. His tone wasn't loud, but it cut sharp and dry. "You're here as a witness, not a legal scholar. Keep your opinions brief or I'll strike them from the record entirely." The silence was immediate. Even the bailiff looked down. Reuben shifted in his chair, his knuckles turned white against the edge of the bench. Lena, meanwhile, stood perfectly still. Then she spoke again, gently but clearly. "May I finish the summary of the Housing Code?" "Your Honor." "It's not my opinion, it's the statute." Judge Brent leaned back in his chair, folded his arms. "You may not," he said. "This testimony is irrelevant. You're wasting the court's time." And just like that, he turned to the clerk. "Strike it. Testimony dismissed." You could feel the collective pause ripple across the room. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just wrong. There was no outburst, no yelling, but something in the air shifted like the sound of dignity being dropped and stepped on. Reuben turned to Lena, mouth half open as if to say something, anything. But she didn't look at him. She just nodded once to the judge, lowered her gaze, and calmly gathered her papers. Her hands didn't shake, but the movement was slow, deliberate, like someone remembering how to breathe underwater. She didn't argue. She didn't correct him. She didn't even blink hard. It was the kind of silence that said everything, a silence too calm to be submission, too still to be weakness. And yet to anyone in that room, including Judge Brent, Lena Hartwell had just been put in her place. The court moved on. The next case file shuffled forward. The next name was called. Lena walked out, leaving behind no titles, no defense, and no clue that the judge had just silenced the one person in that room who could have taught him everything he thought he already knew. The car ride home was quiet. Reuben sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, loosely, eyes fixed on the blur of pine trees sliding past his window. His silence wasn't the kind that asked for space. It was the kind that held questions. Questions he hadn't found the right words for. Eventually he glanced sideways, voice low but steady. "You knew all of that law stuff like the back of your hand," he said. "That wasn't guesswork. That was practiced." Lena kept her eyes on the road. A hint of a smile curved her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've had to learn," she said softly. "Sometimes the law's the only shield you've got when no one else is coming." Reuben blinked, brows furrowed. "But you didn't just learn it. You live it." "Who are you really, Lena?" Her grip on the steering wheel didn't tighten. Her tone didn't change. Just someone who's had to understand how to survive inside systems that weren't built for her. Reuben looked like he wanted to say more, maybe press further. But he didn't. He turned his gaze back to the road ahead and let the question hang there unanswered. Back at home, Lena stepped out of the car and walked up the short path to her porch. Her house was modest, tucked under the arms of 2 willow trees, quiet like she was. The inside smelled faintly of paper and peppermint tea. Books sat in uneven stacks along the windowsills, some legal, some history, some worn novels with folded corners. She moved to the desk near the far wall and opened her laptop. The screen came to life with a soft glow. Her inbox had a new message waiting at the top. Subject: Keynote Confirmation. Annual Judicial Ethics Conference. She clicked it open, scanned the text without rush. "Dear Dr. Hartwell, we are honored to confirm your role as the keynote speaker for this year's Judicial Ethics Conference in Washington, D.C. Your experience, insight, and continued contributions to integrity in the judiciary remain invaluable." She leaned back in her chair, letting the words settle. There was no flash of pride, no visible change in her face. Just a long, thoughtful inhale. A quiet, ticking clock on the wall marked time in soft beats. Somewhere outside, wind rustled through the leaves. She listened to both. Then she reached across the desk and picked up an old photo frame, dust lining its edges. In the photo, Lena stood between 3 people, 2 federal judges, and at the center, the U.S. Attorney General. Lena wasn't smiling wide, just a faint, composed curve of her lips, her eyes steady. There was weight in the way she stood even then. Beside the frame sat a folder slightly frayed. She opened it. The top page read, "Proposed Amendments to the Federal Judicial Conduct Guidelines, drafted by L. Hartwell." The margins were marked with revisions in pen lines, scratched through and rewritten. These weren't classroom notes. These were policy-shaping, system-bending thoughts born from experience, pain, and determination. Lena gently laid the paper down, then glanced at the window. Across the street, she could see the light on in Reuben's living room. He was likely pacing again, trying to make sense of what he had seen in court and what he hadn't seen in her. He didn't know. Neither did Judge Brent, nor the clerk, nor the bailiff, nor anyone else who had sat in that courtroom with their assumptions drawn and their minds already made up. But that was fine, because Lena hadn't stood up to be recognized. She hadn't spoken up to be applauded. She had spoken for a man who was being erased. And she had done it knowing full well the judge might try to erase her too. She sat in stillness, the room around her calm and familiar. Then she spoke almost under her breath, not as a statement, but as a promise. "I don't need them to hear me today, if they'll listen tomorrow." The words hung in the air for a moment untouched. She reached over, shut her laptop, and folded her hands gently in her lap. Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, the silence returned, the kind she had long ago stopped fearing. The kind she had learned to use. Years ago, before anyone forgot her name or dismissed her voice, Lena Hartwell stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of a Senate hearing room in Washington, D.C. The walls were draped with flags, the air stiff with protocol. She was 38, then a federal litigator with a spotless record and a sharp voice honed by years in civil rights law. Her job that morning was to testify on judicial bias in sentencing, a topic she knew too well, not just from research, but from lives she'd watched crumble under quiet injustice. Her written statement had been passed around days before. Pages of careful argument data and policy proposals, each line supported by both law and lived truth. But when she began speaking, offering more than the paper could hold, something shifted. An older senator seated beside 2 federal judges leaned into his microphone and asked Miss Hartwell, "Do you always speak like you're trying to prove something?" Lena had paused. Then one of the judges, a tall man with silver hair and a southern drawl that wrapped around every syllable, smiled thinly and added, "She's articulate, no doubt. Just a little too polished, wouldn't you say?" The room didn't laugh. It didn't need to. It had already dismissed her. That night, Lena walked along the Potomac River alone. Her heels clicked against the stone. Every word she had spoken was still echoing in her chest, but none of it had landed where it needed to. They hadn't refuted her ideas. They hadn't challenged her facts. They had simply reduced her to a woman who sounded too good to be real. That was the moment not of failure, but of fracture. Lena didn't quit the law. She didn't vanish. But she stepped back. She stopped appearing in courts. She declined public panels. Her name slipped from headlines and op-eds. Instead, she became the quiet mind behind major judicial reform bills. She consulted anonymously on ethics reviews. She helped rewrite conduct codes with no byline. And when young judges called for guidance, they found a woman who knew every flaw in the system and how to move within it silently. One evening, years later, Lena sat on her porch with the setting sun streaking the sky in amber. Her phone rang. It was Clara Mendez, a former student from a short-lived course Lena had once taught at a state law college. Clara was now a newly appointed judge in Oregon. "Lena," she said, almost breathless, "I just handed down a ruling that's gonna cause a stir, and I kept hearing your voice in my head the whole time." Lena smiled, letting the memory of the young, scrappy Clara fill her mind. "What did I say this time?" "That silence," Clara said, "isn't surrender. It's a strategy." Lena chuckled softly. "That sounds smarter than how I said it." There was a pause, then Clara's tone shifted softer, reverent. "You taught me that silence can be a way to fight, that it's not the loudest who make change last. It's the ones who know when to step back and when to strike." Lena didn't respond immediately. She watched a moth dance near her porch light, circling, always coming back to the glow. Finally, she said, "Silence didn't make me weaker, Clara. It made me listen better. And when you really listen, you learn what the world refuses to say out loud." Clara didn't answer right away, but Lena knew she heard her. After they hung up, Lena sat a while longer, holding the phone gently in both hands, as if it still carried warmth. The wind brushed against the chimes at the edge of the porch, and the evening sank into stillness. Inside, behind her desk, were letters with seals folders marked confidential and drafts of laws that would reshape everything, all traced back to a woman the courts had once mocked for speaking too well. But none of that mattered now. She didn't need a podium, or a robe, or a title printed on the courtroom wall. She had her words even when unspoken, and her silence earned chosen had become its own kind of justice. Judge Mallory Brent stood at the edge of his office window, a letter in one hand and a scowl on his face. The courthouse below bustled like it always did, but inside that room something had shifted. He read the letter again, slower this time. "The Department of Justice has received multiple reports alleging procedural misconduct and racial bias in recent court proceedings. You are expected to attend the upcoming Judicial Ethics Conference in Washington, D.C. as part of corrective oversight measures." He tossed the paper on his desk like it was junk mail. Of course. "Another lecture from someone who's never ruled a damn courtroom," he muttered, pacing now, hands behind his back. Probably some academic with zero real-world grit. His clerk, a young white man named Avery, cleared his throat cautiously from the doorway. "Sir, it says, it's not optional." Mallory turned to him, eyes narrowed. "What do they think this is, a sensitivity workshop? I've served 26 years on that bench. No amount of slideshows will teach me how to do my job." Avery stepped back. "Of course, Judge. I'll confirm your travel." 3 states away, Judge Clara Mendez sat at a conference call table with 6 other senior advisors from the Judicial Integrity Board. The air was tense, not with disagreement, but with weariness. The system had taken a hit lately. A long list of incidents. Another judge dismissed for racial remarks. A mistrial due to bias. Something had to give. Clara waited for the room to settle before she spoke. "I'm nominating Lena Hartwell as the keynote speaker." Several heads lifted. A murmur followed. Then someone asked carefully, "Isn't she the one from the Hartwell memo?" "She is," Clara replied calmly. "And that's exactly why she should speak." Another member frowned. "She hasn't appeared in public for over a decade." Clara didn't flinch. "Then it's time they remember who she is, and more importantly, what they chose to forget." Silence lingered. "She doesn't come with noise," Clara continued. "She doesn't shame, but she sees through every mask this system wears. And when she speaks, even the ones who don't want to listen do." The motion passed. That night, in her small office tucked behind willow trees and faded curtains, Lena Hartwell opened the finalized program for the conference. Her name appeared at the top of the speaker list. She stared at it a moment, not out of pride, out of gravity. She opened the folder she'd been working on: draft notes, legal references, national statistics. At the very bottom, she tucked in one more file. It was a simple transcript, just 3 pages long, Reuben Collins' case. Her full testimony, the one that Judge Mallory had waved off like lint on his coat. She didn't highlight it, didn't flag it, but she inserted it into the final printed packet labeled Examples of Misapplied Procedure. Civil Case Study. Number 3. No revenge, just precision. Her phone buzzed. Clara again. "You sure you're ready for this?" Clara asked, her voice lower now, more personal. "I was born ready," Lena answered, but with no arrogance. "Just calm truth." "You know Mallory will be there," Clara added, "and he won't take it well. He'll remember you." Lena let the pause hang for a breath. Then she said, "Good. Then maybe this time, he'll remember my words too." Clara exhaled. "You always did know how to hit where it hurts without raising your voice." "I don't need to raise my voice, Clara," Lena said gently. "I just need them to realize I was right the first time." She hung up. Then, reaching for her file, she slid in a final page behind the testimony. A quote handwritten in the margin of her notes. "If the truth is inconvenient, make room for it anyway." She sat back, letting the room fall quiet. There were no lights on but the lamp above her desk. No crowd, no applause. But somewhere across state lines, a man who thought he ruled every room was about to walk into one he couldn't control. And this time, when Lena stood up, there wouldn't be a gavel to stop her. The Grand Hall in D.C. echoed with a kind of quiet only reserved for rooms that hold judgment. It wasn't court, but for many like Judge Mallory Brent, it felt more dangerous than court, because here the power shifted. Here judges sat not above, but among. He arrived early as always. Habit, or perhaps control. He took a program at the door without a glance, brushed past the staff with a nod, and made his way to his seat halfway down the middle aisle. The room was slowly filling with black robes and silver hair voices murmuring in polite strategic tones. It wasn't until he sat that he finally looked down at the program. At first he skimmed the agenda, expecting the same recycled ethics jargon he'd heard for decades. But then he saw it bolded at the top of the keynote page: Dr. Lena Hartwell, keynote speaker, judicial integrity in a divided age. The name hit him like cold water to the back of the neck. His spine stiffened, breath pausing just enough to betray something foreign recognition. The name wasn't supposed to be familiar, and yet it was. He saw a courtroom again. Small, rural, forgettable. A woman composed and clear. A woman who spoke with the kind of legal fluency that made him uncomfortable. He hadn't challenged her argument. He hadn't even let her finish. He had dismissed her. Publicly, deliberately. A low voice behind him whispered, "That's the one who trained half the new circuit judges, isn't it?" Another added, "She was behind the federal reform bill last year. Rumor is she drafted most of it." Mallory swallowed. Tight, dry. When the lights dimmed, the hall shifted. A hush fell slow and heavy, like fog laying itself over still water. This wasn't polite silence. It was reverent, cautious. Then she walked in. No assistant. No stack of papers. Just her. Lena Hartwell. She moved with quiet assurance, not the arrogance of a performer, but the clarity of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Her jacket was sharp, understated. Her eyes calm, almost soft. But what struck the room wasn't what she wore, it was what she carried. Presence. She didn't need to speak yet, the room was already listening. And then came the voice over the PA. "Before you today stands someone who never wore a robe, yet taught hundreds how to wear one with honor. A woman whose influence runs so deep, many of us are better because she never stopped speaking even when no one wanted to hear." Clara's voice. The young Judge Mallory had once brushed off as too idealistic. Now her words rang with the weight of someone who'd learned exactly where to place truth. "She doesn't need a bench," Clara said. "She doesn't need a gavel. She just needs the silence you gave her, and the room to break it." The applause came like a rising tide, not wild, not forced, but steady, earned. Dozens of judges, peers, critics, leaders, standing, nodding, clapping. Some looked curious, others reverent, a few guilty. Mallory didn't clap. He couldn't, because when Lena turned to the audience, her gaze paused on him. Just for a moment. Just enough. There was no scorn in her eyes. No revenge. Just the stillness of someone who remembered being silenced and survived it with clarity intact. She began. There's a silence in courtrooms that no one talks about, she said. It's not the silence of order. It's the silence that follows dismissal. When someone is told their voice doesn't belong here. No slides, no quotes, just her voice. That silence grows, she continued. It waits. It watches. Until one day it speaks, and when it does, we must ask ourselves, are we still fit to listen? Mallory sat motionless. Her words weren't angry. They were measured, steady, but they struck like thunder wrapped in silk. She cited cases, real cases, trends, data, failures, systemic habits that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with who was allowed to be heard. She never mentioned his name. She didn't have to. The room knew. He knew. And when she said justice isn't just what we rule, it's what we refuse to hear. A murmur moved through the rows like wind through dry leaves. Mallory looked around. Other judges weren't fidgeting. They weren't checking phones or glancing at the clock. They were locked in. Because Lena Hartwell wasn't giving a speech. She was delivering a reckoning gently, calmly, devastatingly. When she finished, she didn't wait for applause. She simply said, "May we become the kind of listeners that justice can trust," and walked off stage. Silence, and then thunder. The applause came late but loud. A few judges stood again. Clara wiped her eyes. Even the staff at the back of the hall clapped with both hands. It wasn't performance. It was relief, recognition, respect. Mallory sat there, his hands still on his knees. His throat ached. His palms itched with the urge to clap, not for her, but maybe for something deeper he had long forgotten. And for the first time in 30 years, Mallory Brent felt the shame of having once believed that silence was harmless. He hadn't just dismissed her testimony. He had missed the truth that could have changed him, and now he wasn't sure what to do with the silence left behind. She stood there with the poise of someone who had nothing to prove and yet everything to reveal. The room had settled into that rare, almost sacred quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't demand attention but earns it. Lena Hartwell took one small step toward the microphone. She looked out into the crowd of judges, clerks, and federal observers. And then, with the calmness of a whisper placed on the edge of a blade, she began. There was once a woman, she said, who took the stand in a county courtroom, not to defend herself, but to defend someone who had no voice left. She cited the law clearly. She cited it accurately. But the judge dismissed her testimony, not because it was wrong, but because it was too right. No name, no state, no date. But Mallory Brent's throat tightened with a heat he couldn't swallow. Lena's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Her tone remained steady, almost gentle. But her words pierced like pins through fabric, exposing the shape of something far larger beneath the surface. She walked out of that courtroom with no bitterness in her step, Lena continued. But something stayed behind. Something sat there in that judge's chair. Not doubt, not misunderstanding, but discomfort. A soft shuffle rippled through the crowd. The kind of nervous movement people make when they realize they're no longer just attendees but participants. She was told her words were too educated, too practiced, too professional. And so they could not possibly be authentic, Lena said, as if understanding the law disqualified her from being heard. Mallory shifted in his seat, beads of sweat gathering at the edge of his hairline. He could feel eyes from nearby rows sneak toward him. No one said his name. No one had to. Lena let the weight of her words settle before continuing. Then she leaned in, not closer to the mic, but deeper into the truth. There are many kinds of silence in our justice system, she said. But the most dangerous ones don't come from those who are silenced. They come from those who choose to stay silent. She paused. The air in the hall was still like a lake just before a storm. Silence when we see injustice and say nothing. Silence when we know a colleague is biased, but we excuse it as just their way. Silence when a citizen speaks the truth, but we call it insubordination because it comes from the wrong body, the wrong accent, the wrong color. You could hear nothing but the distant buzz of an air vent, not even the usual rustle of notes or shifting of jackets. Just breath, just hearts beating. just shame settling in like a fog across familiar terrain. And then she asked it, a single sentence, soft and slow, but it hung in the air like a bell still ringing long after the strike. When did justice become allergic to intelligence? If it comes from the wrong color, she didn't shout it. She didn't glare. But the power of the question cracked something open. And for the first time, people weren't just looking at Lena. They were looking at themselves. There was no outrage, no defense, only reflection. Judges who had once prided themselves on their impartiality now fidgeted with their pens, adjusted their ties, avoided each other's eyes. A few looked down completely. Mallory did. He stared at his lap like it held answers he'd never thought to ask. He had dismissed her once as a voice too polished, too confident, too inconvenient. But now that voice had returned, not to punish him, but to hold up a mirror so he might finally see. Lena looked across the room once more. "We were not called to be comfortable," she said. "We were called to be just. And that means listening even when the voice does not flatter us, even when the truth costs us the safety of our traditions." She stepped away from the microphone but didn't leave the stage. "I'm not here today to shame you," she said softer now. "I'm here to remind you what we swore to serve. Justice is not a robe. It is not a bench. It is not a nameplate. It's the courage to say, I was wrong." Mallory closed his eyes. For the first time, the applause did not come immediately. No one moved. It was as if the entire room had been struck, still not out of fear, but reverence. Everyone was staring into their own mirror now, and some truths take a moment to face. Then slowly someone clapped, and another followed. Not a wave, not a roar, just the sound of people remembering what it meant to listen not just to others, but to themselves. And in that quiet between the final word and the first applause, something changed. Not because Lena demanded it, but because they were finally ready to hear her. The room had gone quiet after Lena's bold question. No one moved, not even the judges who had once believed they had all the answers. Lena paused. Not for effect, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to say next. Then gently, she leaned forward and spoke like she was speaking to someone across a kitchen table, not a room full of black-robed authorities. "When I was 24, fresh out of law school, I stood in a courtroom just like this one. I had prepared for days, every argument backed by precedent, every word chosen carefully. But before I could finish my third sentence, the judge interrupted me. She looked out at them not accusingly, but firmly, her eyes calm. He said, 'You're too polished for a black woman. It's unsettling.'" Gasps rippled softly, but Lena didn't flinch. Her voice remained steady. I stood there frozen. Not because I didn't know what to say next, but because I did, and I knew it wouldn't matter. She paused again, this time longer. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment. I stared at the ceiling and thought, do I walk away from this profession? Do I fight that man in court? And then somewhere in the quiet, I made a choice. She turned slowly and looked toward the side of the room where Mallory sat, though not directly at him. I chose not to become the angry black woman they expected me to be. I chose to stay. But I stayed differently. She took a breath. Instead of shouting back, I studied harder. I worked behind the scenes. I began training judges, hundreds of them. Not for applause, not for headlines. Just so, one day, someone like me wouldn't be told her voice didn't belong in a courtroom. For a moment, no one blinked, and I didn't stop because they didn't know my name. I kept going because I knew they remembered my words. There was a subtle shift in the room now. The tension wasn't gone, but it had changed. What was once a wall of pride and hierarchy began to feel more like a mirror held up in silence. Lena continued softer now. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes silence means I'm planning something better than outrage. It means I'm waiting for the right moment, for the right ears. In the front row, Clara sat upright. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she turned to a fellow judge beside her and whispered barely loud enough to hear, "That is justice." No gavel needed. A few heads nodded slowly, not in agreement with Lena's pain, but with the truth in her restraint. She stepped back slightly from the lectern. Her presence didn't shrink with the movement, it grew. As if by pulling away, she allowed the weight of her words to settle fully on those who needed to carry it. Mallory sat motionless, his eyes fixed on her. He had never felt smaller, Not because she had made him feel that way, but because he suddenly saw how little he had understood. All those years, all that power, and he had missed something that had been right in front of him. Lena looked up once more. I didn't stay silent because I was afraid. I stayed silent because I knew one day silence would speak louder than any defense. Then, without asking for applause or acknowledgement, she simply stepped down. The room didn't move. Not yet. Some were still processing. Some were too humbled to speak. But no one would forget that moment. And Lena, she didn't need them to. After the session, most of the attendees filtered out slowly, their faces quiet, their eyes filled with more questions than answers. But Mallory Brent remained in his seat still as stone long after Lena had stepped down. He didn't fidget. He didn't speak. He just sat there watching, listening to the echo of her words reverberate in his own conscience. It was almost half an hour later, after the hallway noise had faded, and the room had mostly emptied, that Mallory finally stood. His steps were hesitant, as if each one was a step further away from the man he had been just days before. Lena was collecting her things at the front of the room. She didn't look surprised when he approached, but she didn't greet him either. For a moment he stood in front of her, searching for the right words, and failing. Finally, with a voice that carried more weight than volume, he said, "I judged you before you said a word." And then I stopped listening. Lena didn't flinch. She placed the last folder into her leather satchel, then looked up at him. Not with anger, but with a stillness that was harder to face. He continued, his voice uneven. "That day in court, I didn't even hear you. I heard what I expected you to sound like. And when you didn't fit, I threw it away." Lena tilted her head slightly. There was something in her expression that was hard to name, calm, yes, but layered with history. She said nothing for a few seconds. Then she replied, not harshly, but with precision. "You didn't hurt me, Judge Brent." She let the pause sit heavy. "You dismissed someone I was protecting." Those words landed harder than any scolding. Mallory's shoulders slumped slightly, the realization hitting deeper than any lecture. "I know," he whispered. "I keep replaying it. That moment. Your voice. I dismissed it because I didn't think it mattered. But it did. It does." He looked down at his hands. "I've worn this robe for over 20 years, and today for the first time I felt unqualified to wear it." Lena gave a soft breath. Not pity, not forgiveness, just breath. Mallory searched her eyes, perhaps hoping for permission to feel redeemed. "I'm not asking for grace," he said, almost more to himself than to her. "I just want you to know. I will do better. I promise." There was a long moment of quiet between them, but it wasn't tense. It was full, like something heavy had settled and something else lighter had been born. Lena looked at him, not to validate his pain, but to honor the truth he'd finally spoken. She didn't give him a speech. She didn't offer a smile or lecture. She simply stepped closer, placed one hand on his shoulder and nodded once, firm, steady, and then she turned and walked away. Not because she'd won, but because she had done what few people ever managed to do. She had held up a mirror and waited long enough for someone to look in. Mallory stood alone for a moment longer, watching her go, his breath tight in his chest. Then he too turned. A different man than the one who had entered that room. Not absolved, but aware. And sometimes that's where real change begins. The Georgia sun had a quiet kind of warmth that afternoon, the kind that didn't demand attention, but soaked into your bones if you stood still long enough. Lena stood at the edge of the old sidewalk, looking at the small white house with the leaning fence out front. There was no fanfare, no cameras, no ceremony. Just a woman coming home, changed, but not removed from where she began. Reuben Collins was out front, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand, carefully replacing a broken slat on the weather-worn fence. He didn't notice her at first. It wasn't until she said his name, soft but clear, that he turned. "Mr. Collins." His hand dropped slowly to his side. For a long second, he just stared. Then his mouth opened, but no words came. He set the hammer down and stepped toward her, eyes already shining. "I saw it," he said, voice catching in his throat. "They played clips of that talk on the local station. I didn't even know it was you. Not at first." Lena gave a faint smile, the kind that held more than pride, more than pain. It held memory. "I told you," she said gently. "Sometimes the fight needs a quieter room." Reuben looked at her with the kind of expression that only comes after years of bitterness finally make room for something better. He wiped his hands on his jeans, then reached up to his face, blinking quickly. "You were the one training those judges," he said, voice low. "The same folks who've been making it hard on us for decades. You were teaching them how to do better." He paused, and then added more to himself than to her. "I kept saying you were someone who understood the law. But now I know. You're someone who's been rewriting how the law is understood." Lena didn't correct him. She didn't have to. They sat on the porch for a while. She asked about his garden, and he joked about the squirrels being more determined than he was. It felt like exhaling after holding your breath too long. A short while later, a car pulled up quietly to the curb. A young man stepped out, maybe 20, with wide eyes and a spiral notebook in one hand. He wore a button-up shirt that didn't quite fit and shoes that had seen better days. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said hesitantly, glancing between Lena and Reuben. "Are you Dr. Lena Hartwell?" Lena turned toward him slowly, curious but calm. "I am. My name's Malik. I saw your speech on YouTube. Twice. My professor showed it to our whole class. I don't mean to intrude, but I drove up from Athens just to ask if you'd ever consider mentoring someone like me." Lena looked at him for a long, quiet moment. She saw the same fire behind his eyes that she once carried at his age, the same hunger to understand, to be better, to not just learn the law but see through it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded, worn document slightly yellowed at the edges. It was a copy of an old court case printed when she was just 22. She held it out to Malik. "This was the first case I lost," she said. "The judge told me I was too polished for a black woman," said it unsettled the courtroom. Malik blinked, his hand trembling slightly as he took the document. "I want you to read it," she said softly, "and then come back. Tell me what that judge should have done better." Malik nodded, eyes wide and serious, gripping the paper like it was sacred. Lena didn't promise anything more. That wasn't her way. Teaching wasn't about giving answers, it was about showing people where to look. As he left, Reuben looked at her sideways. "You're planting something again," he said. "Ain't you?" Lena smiled faintly. "Not just planting," she replied. "I'm leaving roots behind." And as the late afternoon sun dipped lower behind the pine trees, the porch grew quiet again, not empty, but full of what had been passed on. Because sometimes real power doesn't show up with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it comes wrapped in silence and legacy. And that's exactly what Lena Hartwell carried with her. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that only comes after you've finished something that once consumed your whole being. Lena sat alone in her study, surrounded by books worn soft from years of turning pages. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as she slipped a single sheet of paper into a file marked "Personal." It was the same testimony the judge once dismissed without a second thought. She didn't file it away in anger nor in pride. She just placed it gently where it belonged, beside a modest bronze nameplate that read, "Judicial Ethics Consultant." There was no crowd, no applause, just the ticking of a clock and the creak of the old chair as she leaned back. Then she opened her laptop. For a moment, she stared at the blinking cursor on the screen like it was waiting to be told something that had taken years to form. Then she clicked record. Her voice came steady low but unmistakably firm. "The most dangerous bias," she said, "isn't the one we recognize, it's the one we excuse because it wears a robe." There was a pause. Not for dramatic effect, but to let the words breathe. I've seen courts dismiss intelligence when it came in the wrong skin. I've seen men call silence a weakness just because it didn't match their volume. But the law isn't loud. Justice doesn't need a gavel to be heard. It just needs people who refuse to lie to themselves. Then she stopped the recording. She didn't review it. She didn't rehearse it again. She simply saved it to a drive labeled "For the Next Generation." Across the city, at a modest conference center tucked beside the university's law school, Clara stood before a room of young, wide-eyed judicial fellows. She was no longer the newest voice in the room, but she still remembered the moment she found her own. She wasn't there to lecture. She was there to pass forward something she once received without asking. "There's a woman who never raised her voice," Clara told the room. Not once, but every time she spoke, the air got still. People stopped talking. Not because she demanded silence, but because her truth left no room for noise. She let her gaze sweep over the group before continuing. She trained hundreds of judges. You've probably quoted her rulings without even knowing her name. But she didn't care about that. She never cared to be known, only to be understood. Clara took a breath. And when the world told her to speak louder, she chose instead to raise the room. In the back of the hall, one young woman, maybe 23, leaned forward, scribbling something onto a notepad. 3 rows down, a young man looked up from his phone, finally paying attention. No one moved for a moment after Clara finished, not even to clap, because it didn't feel like something to celebrate. It felt like something to carry. Later that evening, in the quiet of the old university library, the cleaning staff passed by a chalkboard tucked into a side alcove. They didn't know who had written it. Maybe a professor, maybe a student. It didn't really matter. In white looping script, the words read, "She didn't fight the system. She trained it to hear itself." And beneath it, scribbled smaller, almost like a footnote left behind by someone who had once doubted her. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is not walk away. Back in her home office, Lena turned off the lamp. Outside, the world kept moving. Traffic passed. A dog barked 2 houses down. Somewhere in the dark, someone was likely telling a story she'd helped write without ever needing the credit. And that, she thought, was enough. Because justice didn't need a spotlight. It needed an echo. And now it had one. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Lena's story isn't just about being heard. It's about knowing when silence holds more weight than noise. She didn't fight with anger. She led with clarity, patience, and truth. And sometimes the deepest justice comes not from a gavel, but from the quiet conviction of one brave voice. If this story touched you, if it made you stop and think, please like this video, share it with someone who still believes in the power of quiet strength, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more true-to-life tales that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after they end. Your support gives our team the motivation to keep creating meaningful content, stories that don't just entertain, but open eyes and shift perspectives. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We echo the truths the world forgot to listen to. See you in the next one.